My name is Isabella Montgomery. I'm in my mid-30s now, and for most of my adult life, I've worked in roles that reward reliability more than visibility. I've been the person people call when something quietly needs fixing. The one who remembers details others forget. The one who doesn't raise her voice, doesn't dramatize conflict, and doesn't demand to be believed. People often mistake that for softness. If you had met me before everything happened, you might have thought I was agreeable, maybe even passive. The dependable daughter, the sensible one in the family, the person who could be trusted not to cause trouble. I was rarely the subject of concern, and almost never the subject of suspicion, until the moment I was. This story isn't about revenge. It's not about exposing anyone for the sake of humiliation. And it's not about painting myself as a hero or my parents as villains. It's about something quieter and more uncomfortable. What happens when loyalty is assumed instead of earned, and when trust collapses the instant evidence enters the room. I was told I had stolen from my own family. No shouting, no confrontation at first. Just a calm certainty from the people who raised me that I must have been responsible. What followed wasn't explosive. It was procedural. Conversations changed tone. Doors closed a little faster. Certainty replaced curiosity. What no one expected was that I wouldn't argue. I didn't defend myself the way people thought I should. I didn't plead. I didn't beg to be understood. I listened. I observed. And eventually, I made a decision that changed every relationship in my life, including the one I had with myself. There is a moment in this story when I call the police, not out of anger, not out of spite, but because it was the only honest move left. And there is another moment, quieter still, when evidence surfaced and family loyalty dissolved so quickly it was almost frightening. Not because of guilt or innocence, but because certainty is fragile when it's built on an assumption. This story moves slowly on purpose, because real emotional reversals rarely announce themselves. They happen in silences, in paperwork, in the choices you make when no one is watching. What you'll hear is my experience, exactly as I remember it. No embellishment, no dramatic twists added for effect. If you've ever been underestimated by the people closest to you, if you've ever realized too late that being the reliable one came with invisible costs, or if you've ever wondered what quiet strength actually looks like when it's tested, then you'll understand why this story still matters to me. Before we begin, let me ask you one gentle question. Have you ever been judged by who people thought you were instead of what you actually did? To my family, I was the stable one, not the exciting one, not the difficult one, not the fragile one either. I was the person whose name didn't trigger worry. If something needed to be handled quietly, forms, logistics, phone calls, I was the obvious choice. I didn't mind, at least I told myself I didn't. Growing up, I learned early that praise came in the form of relief. Good, Isabella's got it. That sentence followed me through my 20s and into my 30s, like a soft stamp on the forehead. Reliable, sensible, low risk. No one ever asked if I wanted to be those things. They just noticed that I was. At family gatherings, I wasn't the loudest voice at the table. I wasn't the one people leaned toward when telling stories. I was usually seated slightly off to the side, listening, refilling glasses, making sure things stayed smooth. If someone needed help printing documents or setting up a new phone, they'd find me without hesitation. And if I did it well, which I always did, it disappeared into the background, as if it had always been that way. That invisibility wasn't cruel. It was comfortable, for them. My parents saw me as dependable in a way that didn't require much attention. They trusted me with tasks, not with emotions. They assumed I was fine because I rarely said otherwise. When decisions were made, I was informed, not consulted. When tensions arose, I was expected to understand both sides without needing to be understood myself. And I complied. Not because I lacked boundaries, but because I believed that being steady was a form of love. In my professional life, it was the same story. I worked in operations, the kind of role where success is measured by the absence of problems. When things run smoothly, no one asks how. I took pride in that. I liked knowing systems, anticipating issues, and keeping records. It gave me a sense of control that didn't depend on approval. But within my family, that same trait translated differently. It meant I was assumed to be uncomplicated, predictable, someone whose inner world didn't need much checking on. If I was tired, I handled it. If I were hurt, I processed it privately. I had learned that emotional economy mattered. Don't spend more than the situation allowed. I wasn't resentful. Not then. I understood the roles families fall into, how they quietly assign weight. Someone has to be the steady one. Someone has to absorb uncertainty so others can move freely. That was me. I remember once during a casual conversation, a relative joked that I was the safest bet in the room. Everyone laughed, including me. It wasn't meant unkindly, but something about it lodged itself in my chest. Safe bets aren't exciting, they aren't questioned, and they aren't always protected. Still, I stayed. I showed up. I kept my notebook close, wrote things down, and followed through. I believed that consistency would eventually be recognized as character, not convenience. What I didn't realize, what I couldn't yet see, was that being invisible in conflict doesn't mean you're neutral. It means others will write the story for you when the pressure comes. And when that pressure did come, it arrived quietly. Not with shouting or accusations at first, but with a shift in tone, a subtle recalibration of how I was seen. Up until that moment, I was the person who made things easier. No one had ever stopped to ask what would happen if I stopped doing that. I didn't know it yet, but the version of me they believed in, the agreeable, dependable, uncomplicated one, was about to become the very reason they felt so certain when they were wrong. And I was about to learn that being underestimated isn't always a disadvantage. Sometimes it's the condition that makes clarity possible. The first sign that something had changed didn't arrive as an accusation. It came as a question that wasn't really a question at all. My mother asked it casually, in the way people do when they already believe they know the answer. We were standing in the kitchen, talking about something unrelated. Grocery prices, I think. When she paused, glanced at me, and said, "You didn't happen to move anything from the study, did you?" Her tone was light, almost absent-minded. I said no without thinking. It was true, and it didn't feel significant enough to warrant anything more than that. She nodded, as if filing it away, and the conversation moved on. No tension, no follow-up. But something in the way she'd looked at me stayed with me longer than it should have. It wasn't suspicion exactly, it was an evaluation. Over the next few days, similar moments appeared, small enough that anyone else might have missed them. A pause before answering my messages. A subtle rephrasing of questions that shifted from, "Do you know where this is?" to, "Are you sure you didn't take this?" Each time I answered calmly. Each time I assumed there was a reasonable explanation. Stress, forgetfulness, miscommunication. Families misplace things all the time. What struck me wasn't the content of the questions. It was who they were directed at, not my siblings, not outside factors. Me. At a family dinner that weekend, my father mentioned that some cash he'd set aside was missing. He said it neutrally, like an observation, but his eyes flicked toward me when he said it, just briefly. No one else seemed to notice. The conversation rolled forward, laughter filling the space he left open. I noticed. I didn't interrupt. I didn't defend myself publicly. There was nothing concrete to respond to, and making a scene over a glance would have felt disproportionate. Instead, I listened. I cataloged the moment the way I always did, with quiet attention. Later that night, I replayed the day in my head, tried to identify what I might have done to prompt this shift. Had I said something wrong, declined a request, created friction without realizing it? Nothing surfaced. The unsettling part wasn't the possibility that they thought I'd done something wrong. It was how easily that possibility had taken shape without discussion. As if a silent conclusion had been reached somewhere, I wasn't invited. I told myself I was overthinking it, that I'd spent too long managing systems and was now applying that same scrutiny to people. I reminded myself that trust isn't fragile in healthy families. And yet, the next cut came a week later. This time, it was a comment made in passing, meant to sound reasonable. "We're just trying to account for everything," my father said. "It's nothing personal." Nothing personal is often the most personal phrase of all. I asked what he meant. He explained that some documents were missing, important ones. He didn't accuse me outright. He didn't have to. The implication sat between us, fully formed. Again, I answered simply. I told him I hadn't touched them. I offered to help look. He accepted the help, but not the explanation. That was the moment I realized something subtle but profound. My words were being recorded, but not believed. They were placeholders, not evidence. Everyone else carried on as usual. No confrontation followed, no family meeting, no raised voices, which made it easier for them to pretend nothing had changed, and harder for me to point to anything specific. But once you feel that shift, you can't unfeel it. The trust I thought I'd earned through years of consistency had apparently a condition attached. It lasted only as long as I didn't complicate the story. And I was beginning to understand that when doubt enters a system without transparency, it doesn't resolve itself. It waits, quietly, patiently, just like I did. After the first few incidents, I did what I had always done when something felt off, but not yet undeniable. I adjusted. I told myself this was temporary, that once whatever was misplaced turned up, as things usually do, the tension would evaporate on its own. No apology would be necessary, no explanation offered. We'd all move on, and the unspoken discomfort would dissolve back into normality. So I made myself smaller in ways that were easy to miss. I spoke less. I offered help more quickly. I was careful not to sound defensive, careful not to seem offended. I understood, I told myself, that suspicion often has less to do with truth and more to do with proximity. I happened to be nearby, available, familiar. That was rational, that was reasonable. What I didn't fully acknowledge was how repetition changes meaning. It wasn't just one missing thing anymore. It was a pattern of absence followed by a pattern of implication. Something would be noticed as gone, and my name would hover nearby, not spoken directly, but never far from the conversation. Sometimes it was a look, sometimes a pause before my parents answered me. Sometimes it was the way conversations shifted when I entered the room, as if something unfinished had just been put away. No one confronted me outright, and that made it harder to respond. You can't defend yourself against the atmosphere. You can only endure it or name it. And I wasn't ready to name it yet. I began double-checking myself obsessively, retracing my steps, asking internal questions I had never asked before. Did I move that folder while helping? Did I set something aside and forget? Could I be misremembering? I knew the answers, but the act of questioning myself changed something. It taught me how easily certainty erodes when you're the only one standing in it. At one point, I offered to write down everything I handled in the house, what I touched, when I was there, what I moved. I framed it as helpful, efficient, a system. My parents thanked me. They did not say it was unnecessary. That was another small cut. I started noticing how quickly my explanations were accepted and then quietly discounted. A nod here, a there, but the behavior didn't change. The suspicion didn't lift. What changed was me. I stopped expecting fairness. Not consciously, more like a subtle recalibration of hope. I learned to anticipate doubt and plan my words around it. I learned which questions would be followed by scrutiny and which would be allowed to pass. This wasn't cruelty. It was something more banal, a slow normalization of disrespect dressed up as practicality. I was still included, still invited, still relied upon, but I was no longer assumed innocent by default. I had become conditional, and because no one ever said that out loud, it felt petty to resist it, dramatic even. I didn't want to be the person who overreacted to nothing, so I stayed quiet. I reminded myself that families go through strange phases, that stress can distort perception, that I didn't need to be validated in every moment to know who I was. All of that was true. What was also true, though I didn't yet articulate it, was that silence was teaching them something, that I would absorb discomfort without requiring repair, that my steadiness could be leaned on even when it was unfair. I remember sitting alone one evening, reviewing a few personal notes I kept for work, timelines, details, dates. I'd always been meticulous, but that night, something shifted. I noticed how clearly events lined up when written down, how different that clarity felt from the fog I experienced in conversation. It was the first time I considered that memory might not be enough. Not for them, and maybe not even for me. Still, I didn't confront anyone. I didn't set boundaries or issue ultimatums. That wasn't who I was, at least not yet. I believed that understanding would eventually reassert itself, that if I remained calm and consistent, the truth would rise naturally. I didn't know then that systems don't correct themselves without pressure, and that people who benefit from ambiguity rarely rush to resolve it. What I did know, what I felt in my body, even if I couldn't yet name it, was that something was being asked of me that went beyond patience. I was being asked to accept a version of myself that I had not chosen. And each time I stayed quiet, that version felt a little more real to them. There's a moment when you stop asking why something is happening and start noticing how it's being managed. For me, that moment came when I realized no one was actually trying to find the missing things anymore. Not in the active sense. There were no systematic searches, no retracing of steps beyond the surface. What existed instead was a quiet assumption that order would eventually be restored, somehow, and that I would be part of that restoration. I wasn't being treated as a suspect who needed to be confronted. I was being treated as a problem that would resolve itself if left in the right conditions. That's when I understood the role I had been assigned. I was the stabilizer, the one who would absorb tension without escalating it, the one who would continue showing up, continuing to help, continuing to smooth things over, regardless of the discomfort directed at her. I was still invited into conversations, but only the practical ones. Still trusted with tasks, but not with the narrative. If there was confusion, I was expected to clarify logistics, not motivations. If there was strain, I was expected to be patient, not affected. It wasn't said out loud, but it was everywhere. You're the one who can handle this. And because I had handled so much before, they assumed I always would. I remember one afternoon when my mother asked me to help organize some paperwork in the study, the same space where several items had supposedly gone missing. The request was casual, almost automatic. She handed me folders, explained what needed sorting, and left the room. There was no acknowledgement of the irony, no hesitation. That was when something settled in me with surprising clarity. If I were truly under suspicion, I wouldn't have been given access. If I were fully trusted, I wouldn't have been watched so closely. The space I occupied was something in between, useful but not believed. That's a difficult place to stand. I noticed how often my parents spoke around issues instead of through them, how they framed their unease as practicality. We just need to be careful. It's better to keep track of things. We're not blaming anyone, except that the effect was the same. And in that environment, my past behavior became a kind of evidence against me. My availability, my familiarity with the house, my history of helping. These traits, once framed as strengths, now function as a silent justification. I didn't push back. Not because I agreed, but because I recognized something important. This wasn't about facts anymore. It was about roles. They had decided who I was in this story, and roles, once assigned, are rarely questioned unless they stop working. I began to see how my calmness was being interpreted, not as integrity, but as compliance. Each time I answered without protest, it confirmed the idea that I would adapt to whatever version of reality made things easier for everyone else. The realization didn't make me angry. It made me precise. I stopped offering emotional explanations. I kept my responses factual and minimal. I didn't volunteer extra context. I didn't try to manage their feelings anymore. If they asked where something was, I answered honestly and briefly. If they speculated aloud, I didn't fill the silence. This wasn't a strategy yet. It was an instinct. For the first time, I allowed myself to see the situation without softening it, without translating it into something more comfortable. I wasn't being misunderstood. I was being used to maintain equilibrium. And as unsettling as that was, it gave me something I hadn't had before, a clear understanding of the system I was inside. Systems don't respond to emotion. They respond to structure, incentives, and disruption. I didn't know yet what I would do with that understanding. I only knew that continuing as I had been, quietly absorbing, quietly adjusting, would eventually cost me something I wasn't willing to lose: my integrity. So I did the only thing that felt honest in that moment. I stopped trying to correct their perception of me, and I started paying attention to what they were showing me instead. The shift didn't happen during an argument. There was no raised voice, no accusation delivered with finality, no moment I could point to and say, "That's when everything changed." It happened on an ordinary afternoon, in a quiet room with nothing dramatic unfolding at all. I was alone in my apartment reviewing some documents for work, the kind of task that requires focus, but not urgency. I remember the light through the window was muted, the city noise distant enough to be ignorable. It should have been a normal day, but I couldn't concentrate. My mind kept returning to the same question, looping without resolution. What would happen if this never corrected itself? Up until then, I had been waiting for clarity, waiting for someone to say, "We found it. We were wrong," waiting for the discomfort to resolve on its own, the way it always had in the past. That afternoon, I realized something quietly devastating. No one was waiting with me. The discomfort wasn't a problem to be solved. It was a new normal that everyone else had already adapted to. My parents had adjusted their expectations. Their trust had been recalibrated. Not openly, but functionally. And because I continued to show up, continued to help, continued to absorb the tension without protest, there was no incentive to revisit that adjustment. I wasn't being punished. I was being reclassified. That realization landed without anger, but with weight. It reframed every interaction I'd had over the past weeks. The pauses, the looks, the careful phrasing. They weren't temporary distortions. They were data points. For the first time, I allowed myself to consider the possibility that fairness might not reassert itself unless something changed. And I understood, with surprising calm, that the change would not come from them. I closed my laptop and sat there, still, longer than necessary. Not spiraling, not planning, just letting the truth settle without resistance. This was the moment I stopped trying to be understood, not out of bitterness, out of realism. I saw clearly that explaining myself further, offering more reassurance, more patience, more access, would only reinforce the role I had already been placed in. It would confirm that I was willing to negotiate my own credibility for the sake of harmony. And I wasn't willing to do that anymore. What surprised me was how little drama accompanied this decision. I didn't feel defiant. I didn't feel vengeful. I felt resolved. The emotional effort I had been expending, monitoring tone, anticipating suspicion, softening my presence, became suddenly visible to me. And once you see the cost of something clearly, it becomes much harder to keep paying it unconsciously. That evening, I made a small change, one that no one else noticed. I stopped volunteering. When my mother called and mentioned she was trying to locate some files, I didn't immediately offer to come help. I said, "I don't know where they are." Nothing more. No follow-up suggestion, no reassurance layered on top. There was a pause on the line, a subtle one, then the conversation moved on. It wasn't a test. It wasn't a statement. It was simply the first time I allowed silence to exist without filling it. Over the next few days, I noticed how often I'd been cushioning conversations without realizing it, how quickly people rely on the person who smooths edges, and how uncomfortable it can feel when that smoothing suddenly stops. No one accused me of changing. No one commented on my distance. But something in the dynamic shifted. The system adjusted, the way systems always do when one component stops overfunctioning. And in that adjustment, I found space. Not freedom, not relief yet, just space. Space to observe without reacting. Space to consider options without urgency. Space to ask a question I had avoided until then. What does protecting my integrity actually require? I didn't have an answer, but I knew it wouldn't involve arguing my innocence in a room that had already decided what my silence meant. The shift that day wasn't visible from the outside. No bridges burned, no doors closed. But inside, something fundamental realigned. I stopped hoping this would fix itself, and I started preparing, quietly, for the possibility that it wouldn't. Once I stopped filling the silence, I began to notice how much work it had been doing. Conversations that once flowed easily now stalled in unexpected places. Questions that used to come wrapped in assumptions arrived bare, without the reassurance I'd previously supplied. It wasn't dramatic. No one challenged me directly. But the absence of my usual responsiveness created small pockets of uncertainty. And those pockets revealed more than any argument could have. My parents didn't interpret my quiet as a boundary. They interpreted it as fatigue, or indifference, or perhaps guilt. Silence, after all, is a blank screen. People project onto it what they already believe. I let them. This was the first time my silence wasn't instinctive or polite. It was deliberate, measured, chosen. That distinction mattered. When my mother mentioned she was still trying to figure out what happened to some missing items, I listened without offering theories. When my father asked me, indirectly, whether I remembered being in a particular room on a particular day, I answered simply, yes or no. No context, no elaboration. It wasn't stonewalling, it was a restraint. And restraint is often misread by people accustomed to over-explanation. They began to speak more, to speculate aloud, to fill the gaps I'd stopped filling. I noticed how quickly narratives form when no one interrupts them. How certainty grows, not from evidence, but from repetition. I took notes, not emotionally, literally. Dates, times, who said what and when. I didn't announce this. I didn't frame it as documentation. It was just a habit I already had, redirected. At first, the quiet felt uncomfortable. I'd spent years being the one who maintained emotional equilibrium. Letting others sit with their own uncertainty felt almost rude. But I reminded myself that honesty doesn't require constant reassurance. What I was refusing to do was manage perceptions that weren't grounded in truth. Still, my parents didn't push. Not yet. From their perspective, the system was holding. I was still present, still available when asked, still calm. They mistook that calm for acquiescence. That misinterpretation gave me room. I began to see how underestimation operates. How people assume that because you don't announce your thoughts, you don't have any. That because you don't react loudly, you won't act at all. I let that assumption stand. The irony wasn't lost on me. The very traits that had made me useful, and therefore suspect, were now making me invisible again. But this time, invisibility wasn't a loss. It was leverage. I didn't correct small inaccuracies when they surfaced in conversation. Not because I agreed with them, but because correcting them prematurely would have changed nothing. I was no longer interested in persuading anyone emotionally. I was interested in clarity. And clarity doesn't come from arguing inside a system that's already decided how it wants to function. It comes from stepping outside of it long enough to see where the seams are. There were moments when I felt the urge to speak up, to defend myself sharply, to ask why no one had considered alternative explanations. Those moments passed when I reminded myself of something important. Defense assumes an honest audience. I wasn't sure I had one, so I stayed quiet, not passive, not defeated, just still. And in that stillness, I began to notice details I'd overlooked before. Patterns in timing, inconsistencies in accounts, small contradictions that didn't align with the conclusions being drawn. Nothing incriminating yet, nothing dramatic, but enough to suggest that the story forming around me was convenient. The more silence I allowed, the more others spoke. The more they spoke, the more information surfaced. And the more information I had, the less I needed to say. By the end of that period, though I didn't know it at the time, something irreversible had already begun. I had stopped participating in the narrative they were constructing about me. And once you step out of a story, you're free to observe it. That freedom didn't feel empowering yet. It felt neutral, clean. But neutrality, I would soon learn, is a powerful position when everyone else is emotionally invested in being right. What they never noticed was how familiar all of this felt to me. Not the accusation itself, but the environment it created. The ambiguity, the lack of a clear process, the reliance on assumption instead of verification. I had spent years working inside systems where those exact conditions caused real damage. I knew what happened when people trusted impressions more than records. And I knew how those situations were resolved when emotions were removed from the equation. So while everything appeared unchanged on the surface, I began preparing, not dramatically, not urgently, but methodically, the same way I handled any complex problem at work. First, I separated feelings from facts. I stopped asking myself why they thought what they thought and focused instead on what was being said, when, and by whom. I wrote things down exactly as they were phrased, not interpretations, not reactions, just data. Cash missing from desk drawer. Files last seen Tuesday afternoon. You were in the house that day. I didn't annotate. I didn't editorialize. I treated it like a record that might one day need to stand on its own. Second, I mapped access. Who had keys? Who had been home? Who had reason to be in certain rooms? I already knew the answers, but writing them out exposed something important. The assumptions being made about me were not based on exclusive access. They were based on familiarity. That mattered. Third, I reviewed my own habits. Not to doubt myself, but to establish timelines. I checked calendar entries, old messages, work logs, emails that confirmed where I'd been on specific days and times. Not obsessively, just enough to anchor memory in something verifiable. The act of doing this didn't make me anxious. It made me calm. Because for the first time since the suspicion began, I wasn't trying to be believed. I was ensuring that if belief ever became necessary, I wouldn't be relying on anyone's goodwill to obtain it. What surprised me was how little resistance there was around me. My parents didn't escalate. They didn't confront me directly. They continued to speak in generalities, to circle the issue without naming it. From their perspective, nothing had changed. From mine, everything had. I began to notice discrepancies in the story as it evolved. Not lies, something more subtle. Shifts in certainty, details that moved depending on the day. Items that were first described as definitely missing, then later as possibly misplaced. None of it was malicious, but it was imprecise. And imprecision is dangerous when accusations exist, even unspoken ones. I didn't point this out, I didn't correct them, I simply noted it. I also began quietly educating myself. Not because I planned to involve anyone outside the family, but because I needed to understand the boundaries of responsibility and process. What does it actually mean to accuse someone of theft? What constitutes evidence? What are the risks of informal assumptions becoming formal records? These weren't abstract questions, they were practical ones. The more I learned, the clearer something became. Situations like this don't resolve emotionally. They resolve procedurally, either through acknowledgement or through escalation. And escalation doesn't have to be loud to be final. What they never noticed was that my silence wasn't empty, it was structured, that my calm wasn't resignation, it was containment. I wasn't waiting anymore. I was positioning myself so that if the story continued without me, it wouldn't be the only story that existed. There was one evening, weeks into this process, when my mother said something that crystallized everything. She said, "We just need to be careful about who we trust." It wasn't directed at me, but it landed squarely. I nodded calmly and agreed. And in that moment, I knew with certainty that whatever happened next would not be about clearing my name socially. It would be about protecting it formally. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel afraid. I felt ready, because when people stop noticing you, they also stop anticipating you. And that is when preparation becomes power. The reveal didn't come with a rush of adrenaline. There was no moment of shock, no sharp intake of breath, no sense of victory. When I finally saw what I needed to see, it arrived quietly, almost gently, as if it had been waiting for me to catch up. It happened while I was reviewing my notes one evening, cross-referencing timelines the way I had done dozens of times before. Dates on their own hadn't meant much. Neither had individual comments. But when I laid everything out in sequence, access, timing, statements, changes in certainty, something clicked into place. Not a culprit, not a confession, a pattern. The missing items followed a rhythm that had nothing to do with me. They appeared and disappeared around moments of stress, reorganization, and urgency, times when people moved quickly, multitasked, and assumed memory would fill in the gaps later. And crucially, those moments often occurred when I wasn't there. I double-checked, then I checked again. This wasn't about proving someone else wrong. It was about establishing that the assumptions being made about me could not be supported by the facts as they existed. Not emotionally, not logically, not procedurally. And more importantly, I realized something else. The longer this stayed informal, the more dangerous it became. Because informal suspicion doesn't require consistency. It doesn't require evidence. It doesn't require correction. It only requires comfort. And everyone else was comfortable. The clarity I felt wasn't satisfying. It was sobering. I understood, finally, that the situation had crossed a line. Not because of what had been said, but because of what had not been said. There had been no direct accusation, no request for transparency, no attempt to protect my reputation while uncertainty existed. My name was being allowed to sit inside doubt. That was the leverage. Not evidence against anyone else, evidence for myself. I could show, if necessary, that I had taken this seriously, that I had documented, that I had verified my whereabouts, that I had approached the situation with care and restraint, and that I had not rushed to defend myself emotionally at the expense of truth. What I also understood, perhaps most clearly in that moment, was that clearing my name inside the family dynamic would never be enough. Even if they believed me later, the damage of being suspected without protection would remain unaddressed. The trust would not simply reset, it would be rebranded. I closed my notebook and sat back, feeling neither relief nor anger, just certainty. This wasn't a family misunderstanding anymore. It was a reputational risk, one that could follow me beyond the walls of that house if left unresolved. And reputational risks are not managed through conversation alone. They are managed through a record. I didn't tell anyone what I had realized. There was no reason to. The knowledge wasn't meant to persuade, it was meant to anchor my next decision. For the first time since this began, I stopped asking myself what outcome I wanted emotionally. I asked myself what outcome I needed structurally, and the answer was clear. I needed an external reference point, a neutral process, a way to ensure that whatever conclusion was reached would not depend on family loyalty, perception, or hindsight. I needed something that would exist whether or not anyone chose to believe me. That understanding didn't make me feel powerful. It made me careful. Because once you see a situation clearly, you're responsible for how you act inside it. And I knew then that whatever I did next would change things permanently. Not explosively, not dramatically, but irrevocably. I wasn't ready to act yet, but I was done hesitating. Once clarity arrived, the illusion of endless options disappeared. Before that, I had lived in a fog of maybe. Maybe this would resolve itself. Maybe someone would notice the inconsistency. Maybe time would soften the suspicion enough that it would quietly disappear. But clarity collapses possibility into responsibility. I saw very plainly that I had three options. The first was to do nothing, to continue as I had been, quiet, present, useful, and allow the situation to fade without formal resolution. This was the path of least resistance. It preserved surface harmony. It required no disruption. It also required accepting that my name could sit indefinitely inside doubt. That option asked me to trust that no one would ever repeat the suspicion elsewhere, that it would never resurface during a moment of conflict or stress, that the people who had been comfortable letting me absorb uncertainty would one day protect me from it. I knew better. The second option was confrontation, to sit my parents down, present what I had documented, and demand clarity, to insist on an apology, or at least an acknowledgement. This option looked strong on the surface, assertive, clean, but I understood something crucial about confrontation. It only works when both sides are equally invested in truth. In our dynamic, confrontation would not be received as information. It would be received as threat, as escalation, as an emotional event to manage rather than a factual situation to resolve. Even if I convinced them, the narrative would become Isabella made a big deal out of it. The focus would shift from the accusation to my reaction. That wasn't justice, that was negotiation. The third option was the one I had been circling without naming, to remove the situation from the family system entirely, to introduce a neutral process that didn't care about my role, my history, or my temperament, one that didn't require persuasion, one that created a record by default. This option came with a cost. It would feel cold, excessive, disproportionate to some. It would permanently alter how I was seen, not just as a daughter, but as a person who did not quietly absorb harm for the sake of comfort. I sat with that understanding for days, not because I was afraid of consequences, but because I wanted to be certain of my motive. I wasn't trying to punish anyone. I wasn't trying to embarrass my parents or prove a point. I didn't want anyone to be shamed or blamed. What I wanted was simple. I wanted my name out of the story, and the only way to do that, cleanly finally, was to place the story somewhere that operated on evidence, not assumption. The moment I made the decision was unremarkable. I was standing in line at a coffee shop, listening to a conversation behind me about a completely unrelated misunderstanding. One person said, laughing, "Once people decide something about you, it's almost impossible to undo." It wasn't profound, but it landed. I realized then that waiting any longer wasn't patience. It was permission. That evening, I reviewed everything one last time, not to check for errors, but to check myself, my tone, my intentions, my boundaries. And then I chose. I would involve a neutral authority, not as an accusation, not as an attack, but as a line. Once crossed, there would be no rewriting the past, no softening the narrative, no pretending this had never happened. That was the cost, and I accepted it calmly, because I understood something my younger self had not. Peace built on silence is fragile. Integrity built on clarity is not. When I went to bed that night, I slept better than I had in weeks. The decision had been made. The rest was execution. I didn't tell anyone what I was about to do. Not because I was hiding it, but because an explanation would have changed the nature of the act. This wasn't something to be debated or softened. It was something to be done cleanly, without commentary. I moved the way I always had, quietly, methodically, without spectacle. The first step was gathering what already existed. I organized my notes, timelines, and records into a single, coherent sequence. Not a narrative, a chronology, dates, locations, access points, statements as they had been spoken, not interpreted. It took less time than I expected. That was how I knew I had been preparing for this long before I consciously decided to. I didn't dramatize the situation when I reached out for guidance. I didn't frame it as betrayal or family conflict. I described it neutrally: missing property, implied suspicion, no formal accusation, and a need for clarity. I was careful with my language. Precision mattered. What struck me most was how ordinary the process felt. No raised eyebrows, no judgment, just questions designed to establish facts. That alone told me something important. The weight I had been carrying was not inherent to the situation. It had been created by ambiguity. I followed the process exactly as instructed. No embellishment, no emotional appeals. I didn't speculate about motives or outcomes. I stated what I knew, what I didn't, and what I could verify. When I made the call, my voice didn't shake. I wasn't angry, I wasn't scared, I was resolved. Afterward, nothing visibly changed. I still showed up to family gatherings. I still answered messages. I still spoke calmly. There was no dramatic pause, no sense that a threshold had been crossed. From the outside, I was the same person I had always been. That was the part no one noticed. They assumed my quiet meant inaction, that my calm meant acceptance. That was because I hadn't protested loudly, and I wouldn't act decisively. They mistook stillness for stasis. In the days that followed, conversations continued as usual. My parents discussed logistics, plans, and minor frustrations. Occasionally, the topic of missing items surfaced again. Always vaguely, always without resolution. I didn't intervene. I didn't correct assumptions or offer reassurance, not because I was withholding kindness, but because I was no longer responsible for managing uncertainty that wasn't mine. What I felt during that time wasn't anticipation. It was a distance. A clean emotional distance that allowed me to see things as they were, not as I wished them to be. There was a strange calm in knowing that the situation now had a structure independent of me, that the outcome would not depend on how convincingly I spoke or how patiently I endured. I had done what I could, and I had done it honestly. If nothing came of it, so be it. At least there would be a record, an acknowledgement that my name had been placed under scrutiny and that I had responded with transparency, not defensiveness. That mattered to me more than being immediately believed. I remember one evening, sitting across from my parents at the dinner table, listening to them discuss something unrelated. They laughed. They disagreed mildly. Life continued. They had no idea that the story they thought was static had already begun to move. And I realized then that true power doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need to. It operates quietly, on timelines that don't require permission. I didn't feel victorious. I felt aligned. For the first time since this began, my actions matched my values. I wasn't avoiding conflict or seeking validation. I was protecting my integrity without spectacle. And that was enough, for now. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They came the way most real consequences do, quietly, unevenly, and without explanation. A delay here, a question there, small interruptions in the rhythm my parents were used to controlling. At first, they blamed the inconvenience. My mother mentioned that someone had asked follow-up questions about the missing items. She framed it casually, almost dismissively, as if it were an unnecessary formality. "It's probably nothing," she said, waving it away. "Just procedure." Procedure. The word landed differently for me. My father became more careful in his phrasing. He stopped making offhand remarks about things being misplaced. When the topic came up, it was with qualifiers. "I'm not sure. I might be mistaken. It could have been moved." The shift wasn't conscious, it was reactive. They felt something tightening around the story, even if they couldn't yet see its shape. What they didn't realize was that for the first time, their uncertainty had weight. It wasn't floating harmlessly between us anymore. It had entered a system that required consistency. I watched this happen without satisfaction, not because I was detached, but because I understood something they didn't yet. Once a narrative is asked to justify itself, it begins to unravel on its own. There was no confrontation, no dramatic reveal, just a gradual erosion of confidence. They began retracing steps out loud, reconsidering timelines, revisiting moments they had previously spoken about with certainty. The story softened at the edges, then at the center. I stayed quiet, not strategically this time, but respectfully, because now silence wasn't avoidance. Also, was proportion. The more they talked, the more the gaps became visible. And the more visible those gaps became, the less space there was for assumption. One afternoon, my mother called me with a question that would have been unthinkable weeks earlier. Do you remember if anyone else was here that day? Not you, anyone else. That single shift carried the weight of everything that had changed. It wasn't an apology, it wasn't accountability, but it was movement. My father followed shortly after, asking me to clarify a date, not because he doubted me, but because he doubted himself. He didn't say that out loud. He didn't need to. I answered honestly, briefly, and for the first time, my answers weren't treated as placeholders. They were treated as information. Still, no one acknowledged the loss yet, because there was a loss. They had lost the comfort of certainty, lost the ease of assigning suspicion without consequence, lost the ability to let ambiguity sit unchallenged, and that loss unsettled them more than they expected. I noticed tension creeping into their conversations with each other, small disagreements about memory, about sequence, about responsibility. Things that had been smoothed over before were now being examined. Not because I forced it, because once the process existed, it demanded coherence. I didn't gloat, I didn't correct the record. Proactively, I let it unfold, not out of cruelty, but because inserting myself emotionally would have pulled the story back into the family dynamic, and that was no longer where it belonged. What surprised me most was how little relief I felt. I had imagined, if I allowed myself to imagine at all, that there would be a moment of validation, a sense of finally. Instead, what I felt was distance solidifying into clarity. I saw my parents not as villains or betrayers, but as people who had chosen convenience over care, and were now struggling with the cost of that choice. And I understood something else, too. Even if everything resolved cleanly from this point forward, something fundamental had already changed. Not because of what I did, but because of what they had been willing to let stand. The consequences had begun, they just hadn't fully arrived yet. The moment they realized something was truly wrong wasn't when questions were asked. It was when answers were required. Up until then, my parents had lived inside a kind of flexible uncertainty. They could revise their memories without admitting fault. They could soften their language without confronting the implications. But once the process moved forward, that flexibility disappeared. Suddenly, timelines mattered, details mattered, and consistency mattered most of all. I could see it in the way my mother spoke more quickly now, as if speed might outrun consequence. She began revisiting conversations we'd had weeks earlier, rephrasing them aloud. I didn't mean it that way, she said once, unprompted. I was just thinking out loud. Thinking out loud had never felt dangerous before. My father, on the other hand, grew quiet. Not reflective, contained. He asked fewer questions, but when he did, they were precise. Too precise for someone who believed nothing serious was happening. They were both trying, in their own ways, to regain control of a story that had slipped out of their hands. What they didn't yet understand was that control was no longer possible. You can't rewind a process that has already recorded its first entry. You can't reframe intentions once actions are documented. And you can't retroactively protect someone's reputation after allowing it to sit under suspicion. I could sense the regret before it was ever voiced. Not regret for accusing me, because they had never done that explicitly, but regret for letting implication do the work of accusation without accountability, for assuming that silence meant safety, for believing that family dynamics could contain what should have been handled with care. They began to float solutions. Maybe we should all just move on. Maybe this doesn't need to go any further. Maybe it was all a misunderstanding. Each suggestion arrived too late. Not because I was unwilling to forgive, but because forgiveness doesn't erase the process, and the process doesn't pause for emotional readiness. I listened. I acknowledged their feelings. I did not intervene. That restraint was the hardest part. There were moments when I could have stepped in, softened the edges, redirected things back into private resolution. And if this had happened earlier, before assumptions had hardened, that might have been possible. But now, any attempt to fix it would have required something they still weren't offering, a full acknowledgement of what had been allowed to happen. Instead, they hovered around it, apologized for the stress, for tension, for things feeling off. Never doubt, I realized then that what frightened them most wasn't the possibility of being wrong. It was the permanence of having been unjust. Because injustice, once recognized, demands a reckoning, and they had built their identities around being fair people. The confusion set in next. My parents began asking each other the same questions repeatedly, as if repetition might yield a different answer. They searched again, reorganized, double-checked places that had already been checked. This time not to find what was missing, but to find reassurance. I watched all of this with a strange mix of empathy and detachment. Empathy, because I could see how disorienting it is to realize you've misjudged someone you love. Detachment, because the moment for protecting me had passed. Even if everything ended cleanly, even if clarity arrived, the fact remained. When evidence was absent, my credibility had been optional. And that truth doesn't disappear once it's seen. There was a night when my mother called me late, her voice unsteady. She said, "I just want things to go back to normal." I understood what she meant, but normal had been built on my silence, and I wasn't willing to return to that. I told her, gently, that I wanted clarity too, that I wasn't angry, that I wasn't trying to punish anyone. But I didn't offer a way out, because there wasn't one. Not anymore. What was unfolding had its own momentum now. It would resolve one way or another, on terms that didn't belong to any of us individually. And that was the moment they understood something had been lost that couldn't be restored with good intentions alone. Trust, once fractured quietly, doesn't shatter loudly. It just stops flexing. The confrontation, if it can even be called that, happened on a quiet morning. No one raised their voice. No one interrupted. There were no accusations traded back and forth like weapons. It was simply the first time we sat together and spoke about the same reality without pretending it was something else. My parents asked if I could come by. Their message was careful, almost formal. I agreed, not because I felt obligated, but because I knew avoidance would only prolong what needed to be said. When I arrived, they were already seated at the table. Papers were stacked neatly in front of my father. My mother's hands were folded, her posture too deliberate. It was clear they had rehearsed what they wanted to say, or at least the tone in which they wanted to say it. They began by explaining stress, confusion, a difficult period. They emphasized that no one had meant to accuse me. Those things had simply spiraled. I listened without interruption. When they finished, there was a pause, the kind that invites reassurance, the kind I used to fill automatically. This time I didn't. I thanked them for explaining. I told them I understood how stress can distort perception. And then, calmly, without emphasis, I said something that shifted the room. I said that intent wasn't the issue. What mattered was that my name had been allowed to sit under suspicion without protection. Those assumptions had been repeated without verification, that no one had paused to consider how that would land on me, or what it would require to repair. I didn't raise examples. I didn't quote their words back to them. I didn't list grievances. I didn't need to. They knew. My father nodded slowly. My mother looked down at the table. There was no denial, just recognition. I told them I hadn't acted out of anger, that I hadn't involved anyone else to force an outcome. I had done it because I needed a clear record, one that didn't depend on memory or family dynamics. I said I wasn't trying to prove anyone wrong. I was trying to protect myself. That was the moment the room went very still. Not defensive, not hostile, still. My mother asked, quietly, why I hadn't just come to them sooner. I answered honestly, because I didn't feel safe doing so, not physically, emotionally. Because once doubt entered the space, it wasn't addressed, it was managed. And I had learned, through experience, that speaking up inside that dynamic would only reposition me as the problem. I didn't accuse them of bad faith. I didn't say they were unfair people. I said they were people who had made a choice without realizing it. A choice to prioritize ease over clarity. That landed harder than any raised voice could have. There were apologies then, real ones. Not for stress or misunderstanding, but for not protecting me when uncertainty existed. For assuming I would endure discomfort without needing repair. I accepted them. Not dramatically, not emotionally. Simply. But I was also clear about something else. I told them that while I was willing to move forward, I wouldn't return to the role I'd been in before. That I wouldn't absorb ambiguity silently. That if questions arose in the future, they would need to be addressed directly. Or not at all. This wasn't a threat, it was a boundary. They agreed, immediately, a little too quickly, perhaps. But I wasn't there to test sincerity. I was there to state terms. The conversation ended, without closure, in the way movies promise it. No hugs, no declarations about family, above all else. Just a quiet understanding that something had changed. As I left, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not relief, respect. Not necessarily from them, but from myself. Because for the first time, I hadn't traded clarity for comfort. I hadn't softened the truth to preserve peace. I had spoken plainly, without heat, and allowed the consequences to exist. And that was enough. I didn't become someone new overnight. There was no dramatic reinvention, no declaration of independence, no clean break from the past. What changed was subtler than that and far more durable. I stopped negotiating my credibility. For most of my life, I had believed that being reasonable meant being flexible, that love required absorption, that staying calm was the same thing as staying safe. Those beliefs weren't wrong, but they were incomplete. What I understand now is that integrity isn't passive. It's maintained. And maintenance requires boundaries. In the months that followed, my relationship with my parents settled into something quieter and more precise. We spoke less frequently, but more honestly. When misunderstandings arose, they were addressed early or not at all. There was less assumption, less emotional shorthand. It wasn't warmer, but it was cleaner. I noticed changes in myself before I noticed them in others. I stopped over-preparing explanations, stopped anticipating doubt. If someone questioned my actions or intentions, I answered directly, and then I stopped. I didn't chase reassurance. I didn't manage discomfort that wasn't mine. That shift extended beyond my family. At work, I became more explicit about scope and responsibility. I documented decisions. I clarified expectations, not defensively, but professionally. I wasn't less kind. I was more exact. And the strange thing was, people adjusted. The version of me that had been quietly reliable without asking for recognition had made others comfortable. The version of me that required clarity made them respectful. I didn't lose relationships, I refined them. There was no bitterness in this process, no tallying of wrongs. I didn't revisit the past in search of validation. I let it stay where it belonged, as a reference point, not a wound. Because I didn't need to punish anyone to honor myself. What stayed with me most was the lesson about silence. Silence isn't virtuous on its own. It's only virtuous when it's chosen, and when it doesn't cost you your name. I'm still quiet by nature. I still observe more than I speak. I still value steadiness. But now my silence has edges. It's no longer something others can mistake for consent. I also understand something about power that I didn't before. Power doesn't look like dominance in the obvious sense. It looks like alignment, like knowing when to speak and when not to, like being willing to let systems do their work instead of demanding emotional resolution from people who aren't ready to offer it. I don't regret how things unfolded, not because it was painless, it wasn't, but because it clarified something I needed to learn. That loyalty without protection isn't loyalty at all. That being useful is not the same as being valued. And that justice doesn't require spectacle to be real. When I think about who I am now, I don't define myself by what I endured or what I proved. I define myself by what I no longer accept. And that, more than anything, has changed how I move through the world. Quietly, deliberately, without apology. There's a temptation, when telling a story like this, to frame it as a victory. To point to the moment when doubt dissolved, when evidence appeared, when the balance finally tipped. But that would miss the truth of what actually mattered. This story wasn't about being proven right. It was about what happens when you're expected to carry uncertainty so others don't have to. For a long time, I believed that staying quiet was a form of strength, that absorbing discomfort was the price of belonging, that if I remained calm and consistent, fairness would eventually find its way back to me on its own. What I learned is that fairness doesn't move on hope alone. It moves on structure. The most painful part of this experience wasn't the suspicion itself. It was how easily it was allowed to exist without challenge. How quickly loyalty shifted once evidence entered the room. How fragile family certainty became when it had to stand on facts instead of assumptions. That realization didn't make me cynical. It made me precise. I no longer confuse silence with virtue or loyalty with self-erasure. I don't assume that people will protect my name simply because they love me. I understand now that love without accountability can still cause harm. And that doesn't make people evil. It makes them human. What matters is what we do once we see that clearly. I chose not to retaliate, not to humiliate, not to dramatize. I chose process over performance, record over reaction. I chose to let the truth exist independently of anyone's comfort. That choice cost me something, but it also gave me something invaluable. A version of myself that doesn't need to be defended loudly, because it's supported quietly. If there's a moral here, it isn't always call the authorities or never trust your family. That's not the lesson. The lesson is this. If your integrity depends entirely on how others feel about you, it isn't protected. If your silence is required for peace, that peace isn't shared. And if loyalty collapses the moment evidence appears, then loyalty was never the foundation. It was convenience. You don't need to be loud to be firm. You don't need to be cruel to be clear. And you don't need to destroy relationships to stop sacrificing yourself inside them. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to carry what was never yours to hold. Quiet dominance isn't about winning. It's about alignment. Thank you for listening to this story all the way through. If it resonated with you, if you've ever been underestimated, doubted, or expected to stay silent to keep things smooth, I'd really like to hear from you. Have you ever had a moment where staying quiet cost you your credibility? And what did you do when you realized it?